So welcome to Michelle Taylor from New Zealand Institute for Plant and Food Research. Michelle's going to join us today to talk about slow the spread. And we're just going to delve into a little bit about what slow the spread means and what it means in Australia's context as well. So Michelle, could you share with us the why and the what behind a slow the spread opportunity, given that we're just in the process of officially transitioning to managed Varroa in Australia after our eradication efforts?
The importance of the why is that you need to give yourselves time to be able to get your methods in place of how you're going to control Varroa. So the longer that you have in terms of slowing the spread, then it means that your Aussie colleagues are going to have time to be able to prepare for Varroa. So preparing can either be deciding how they want to control Varroa or deciding whether they would actually like to exit the industry. And that is actually a really important thing to be able to do. The information that you have will enable you to be able to decide how you want to move forward, either within the industry or outside the industry.
Yeah. So would you say that, like I think some beekeepers might be thinking that slow the spread just purely means restrictions and rules, but it's more about, yeah, as you say, learning, monitoring, learning things that we need to adapt now and change to. So education is one of those components that we need to take on to be able to learn those new skills. Are you thinking that Australia's best off to mimic some of those experiences in New Zealand? The education rollout was really quite intense and it covered as many beekeepers as possible, but slowing the spread's not just about restrictions of movements, it's actually about monitoring and understanding the risks if you don't uptake these new kind of skill sets.
Yeah, slowing the spread is about giving yourself a chance, giving your industry a chance to transition to management, which is your catchphrase, which is actually very adaptive. I love it. You are transitioning from a place where you have had no Varroa, and then you've transitioned from a place where you're eradicating Varroa to a place now where you choose to manage Varroa. And that time, everything, it is important for everything. So giving yourself the time means that you can figure out what monitoring techniques you're going to use. It gives yourself time to identify the chemicals or the biotechnical methods or the organic control methods or the timing that is required for when you're controlling your Varroa. So slowing the spread enables the people that don't have Varroa in the area to be able to make those management decisions. And then also it enables, for a lot of you are transitional beekeepers, so you're moving throughout the country. And so what that might mean for you now is that you can't move to some places because of the restrictions. But what that means is that your colonies in some of those other areas that you have also don't have Varroa. So you can maintain those colonies still the way that you used to until Varroa gets to that area. So that's what slowing the spread is about. It's making it so that you're dealing with the colonies that have Varroa now in a way that you can ease into that in a much easier way.
Yeah, great. Yeah. So people who, we've got a heat map at the moment established for most of New South Wales beekeepers that report that's fairly quickly updated so that people are aware of the location of Varroa. So reporting is a really important part for Australian beekeeping at the moment, and we're hoping that will continue through the transition phase. But if beekeepers in other states of Australia don't think they've got Varroa at the moment, and maybe they're living in a bubble, but would it be important for them to really continue monitoring for Varroa, even if a heat map doesn't exist near them or if there isn't an apparent risk? Now that it's here, do you think it's a really first initial new practice to undertake sort of alcohol wash or sugar shaking or soapy water wash to monitor consistently for Varroa presence or absence?
Yeah, so that monitoring gives you peace of mind. But what it does is it helps you within that area understand whether you need to take on a full treatment regime or whether you're okay for another year. So if you can work with your industry and the people around you in that area to come up with a monitoring plan, then that will lighten the load even more. So working together with your fellow beekeepers, and I know that especially in New Zealand that was very difficult. but actually moving forward together is better because it lightens the load. So if you can work with your neighbours to so someone's going to monitor, a couple of, in spring, someone's going to monitor early summer, someone's going to monitor early autumn, and then someone's going to monitor late autumn. That should catch all of those periods there. You've probably got a window of about anywhere from 9 to 15 months before your colonies die. You're in Australia where you've got large amounts of brood all year round. So I imagine that window will be shorter than what we were blessed with in New Zealand. We had a much larger window because we have natural attrition over winter. So what that means is we don't have any brood or limited brood, and so our mites die naturally, and so they fall out of the colony, and the population of bees is larger than the mites are. But you don't have that. You've got your bees that are breeding the whole time, which means that the Varroa are breeding the whole time, and their growth is similar to an exponential curve. So if it's similar to that, then that means that very quickly your colony will be overwhelmed with Varroa. So that is the importance of monitoring to understand whether it's come into your area, because your window of survival, if you don't treat, is very short.
Yeah, so I was going to mention, I'm hearing here in Australia from some beekeepers who are in New South Wales, and they've kind of done their alcohol washes, and they're finding really large mite numbers. Right. But they're saying that those colonies are reportedly really strong colonies. They're really healthy, and it's a surprise to see them dealing with quite large mite numbers. Obviously, we know we've got some evidence around the country that deforming virus is not present in Australia at the moment. So we could probably say, is it right to say we can handle a little bit of a higher mite load? But what's your experience in NZ in the beginning with like mite loads and healthy colonies? So could you talk a bit about that? What you've seen, what's happened in NZ as in that early phase that kind of mimics what we've got here?
Yeah. So colonies are really good at surviving because that's what they do. They survive. The mite levels develop, and it's not until you start to see mites in the colony that the colony is starting to be overwhelmed with mites. And at that point there, your colonies will start to break down. Not immediately, but they will start to break down. So yes, you will see super healthy colonies. You'll do an alcohol wash, and you could have anywhere in excess of 20 mites, 30 mites, 40 mites, and your colony will still be fine. We had colonies in New Zealand that I think the highest number of mites that we had was 51,000 mites, but we took the whole colony apart. But it had 51,000 mites, and it was still completely fine. And that was in the early days before we had deforming virus. So I don't think we would see the same thing now, but we still do see very healthy colonies, and you'll do an alcohol wash on them, or a soapy wash, or a sugar shake, and you'll find a large number of mites in there. And so at that point there, you need to get your treatment strips in straight away.
Yeah, so we're in this sort of phase in Australian conditions at the moment where I would expect this is the large curve of bee populations, and then large alcohol wash numbers to me seem like that curve of Varroa just really outnumbering the bee population at this particular seasonal time. So we're, for people watching this later on, this is, we're in February, so it's the peak of our summer. It's also the peak of our bee population. If those numbers are really high in alcohol washes at the moment, and beekeepers, maybe they're not monitoring, right? Maybe there's a few people out there not monitoring, and potentially they've got similar numbers of Varroa. Do you think they'll have bees in winter? Do you think they'll have bees next season? How high a risk is it to not implement a monitoring process, and also to just not actually act on it, not provide some intervention?
Monitoring is all about risk and mitigating that risk. So if you choose not to assess a colony for mites, then you might miss that colony having mites. So therefore that colony will die. So you've got to figure out where your risk is and how much risk you're prepared to take. So if you're prepared to lose 50% of your colonies, because you're only going to treat the colonies that have Varroa, then you, if you only assess 50, then you have to be prepared to lose those 50. If you are assessing your colonies and you assess 50% of them, and as soon as you find one with Varroa, then you're going to treat everything, the risk is a little lower. But if you're only treating an individual colony based on an individual assessment, then your risk is much, much higher, because you'll miss a whole bunch of colonies that have Varroa. So are you going to have colonies? So at this time, so now we're right at the start of, well, we're pretty much at the end actually of January, very start of February. So what that means is the mite levels have been really high over January period, and they're going to be your bee populations, if that is what's occurring in your area, are starting to decline a little bit, but they still have a large amount of brood in there. Your mite populations are going to keep on growing, so therefore the pressure on your colony to survive will be much higher than it will be in winter. So you want to be going into winter with at least 2 brood cycles of healthy bees. So what that means is 2 brood cycles of healthy bees. So a brood cycle being 21 days, but a Varroa cycle is about 14 days, give or take a day or two. So it depends on how long they'll stay out of the cap brood and on a nurse bee. So that cycle is much shorter, faster than what our bee cycle is, because it's only in the cap brood stage. So therefore your growth of that is higher than what it is when your bees are producing and are increasing so in spring your bees are increasing and they'll out increase the Varroa, but in autumn it's the other way around. Your Varroa is out increasing your bees, and so that population growth just is exponential, so it just keeps on expanding. So that's the risk that you're taking.
It's a big balancing act.
Yeah.
And if you're not going to be aware of the presence or absence, it's really going to be key in that long-term survival of those colonies you might be managing. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's a good point. I guess people need to start just understanding more about those different amounts of change in population, both Varroa and bees, just to be able to understand we're going to have different threshold amounts throughout the year. And that's part of us learning about, what Varroa is like in Australia's conditions. It's going to be very different. I guess what was the difference? Like average threshold at the moment is around 6 or more mites, given some of our technical information that's put together in New South Wales at least. What would be the difference? Like you guys had deforming virus maybe 6 years down the track. So the difference is very large now. But in winter and summer, there's different thresholds. So people need to start, I guess, understanding that and keeping in touch with each other and finding good information to assess their bees and make those management interventions kind of earlier rather than later, if there's any management at all. Do you think like the waves of reinfestation were really problematic in the first few years for New Zealand beekeepers?
So partly because beekeepers didn't have a good understanding of how to manage the colonies, but partly because you put your treatment strips in, and then somebody else didn't put their treatment strips in at the same time, and so therefore they got there was ferals also that was still around in the environment, so they had populations of Varroa that weren't being treated. So those first years were very difficult because beekeepers, they would do their really best, put their treatment strips in, and then come back and the colonies would be robbed out or dead because the feral bees had come in or other things had occurred. So there was quite a few factors that were going on in those early stages. So it's very hard to put a pattern in those first few years. And that's why the monitoring is important, because the day that you do the monitoring is an assessment of that day, but then after that, something else could happen. So the other part that needs to come into, you need to take into consideration is that when you're doing the monitoring, how far spread is your monitoring? So I talked earlier about, doing 4 throughout the year, but actually in autumn or when your Varroa populations are high, in those first few years, that actually might be really important for you to go and do some more assessments on a regular basis once you've found it in the area. So we were talking initially about is it in the area stage, but once it's in the area, You can't just put your treatment strips in and walk away, or you can't do your particular
like intervention. Whatever it might be. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, because you don't know whether it's worked or not, and so there might be additional factors coming in from outside that you need to manage. So
yeah, and we talk about mite bomb, and you and I talked previously when I was in NZ about mite bombs being really key in this conversation, especially that's what my brain leads to. But there's also this mysterious mite bomb from other beekeepers. But once we get into the groove of managing Varroa, potentially our feral populations of bees will disappear to quite a lot. Very obvious that that's happened everywhere else in the world, so it's going to happen here too. Can people be a little bit slack and blame other beekeepers about mite bombs? Is that happening over there?
Yeah, human nature, right? It's always easier to blame somebody else. The better thing though is to take it on the chin and say, actually, you know what? I look at what you did and look to see what you could have done and what possibly you did that may have caused the problem of Varroa. Because Varroa can be managed, you just have to make sure that your timing is really good. So rather than blaming another beekeeper, the best thing to do, and our beekeepers are starting to take that on board now, is to look at what is going on in your environment, looking at how you're managing your Varroa, and seeing whether the gap between your treatment that you did last time and your treatment now was too late, too long, I mean. So if the duration was too big, the mite population builds up too quickly, and then your colony won't have a chance to be able to survive. So take it on the chin. You lost some hives, so be it. Let's not lose them again next year because another mite bomb has come along. Just look at your management and see if there was anything. If not, fine, it was a mite bomb. But actually, look deep at your management. Have some really good discussions with people that you can bounce ideas off with and say, hey, was it this, or could it have been that, or blah, blah, blah. Have a check and really then change your management because of that.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's great. That's excellent. So, yeah, so some of the other, I guess, components to managing now that we have Varroa is really about bolstering what we already know about good beekeeping practice. So, you know, the things that spread Varroa, robbing, drifting, those sorts of things. So, and swarming, managing that in Australia's, you know, already that's a big factor. We've got some great country in Australia that produces fantastic honey and very healthy bee colonies. So they talk about Varroa having a honeymoon phase, and I think Australia's absence of Varroa for the last 50 years is the honeymoon phase. And now we're moving into like the really hard yards of learning on the fly, learning on the run. Best if a lot of beekeepers around the country start learning now. If they don't have it, they still can learn lots of stuff. But in terms of like bee managing and the increase in the benefit of learning new skills and implementing those sort of best management changes, what do you think the biggest ones are? What do you think the biggest sort of mindset, cultural change can be the benefit for us in slowing the spread?
The biggest mindset probably is a change from going from no chemicals to chemicals for us in New Zealand. So that was the biggest thing for us. So we lost some beekeepers because they were not prepared to manage bees with chemicals. So the education program enabled them to keep their colonies alive and treat them, and then sell them as a going concern and move out of the industry. So that was the biggest mindset for us. The second thing was that beekeepers needed to understand that if they couldn't see the mite, it was still a problem. So just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not there and it's not breeding. So it's a little bit like bacteria in, you know, your yogurt or whatever. It's still there growing. You just can't always see it until it's turned a different color and it's wrong. So you know what I mean? It's in there, it's breeding, and if you're not managing it, then it's going to destroy your colony. So getting that mindset around the fact that actually these things are in your colony. You have one Varroa in the colony that will kill your hive within the next 15 months because she is pregnant. She is ready to reproduce, and her offspring are going to reproduce exponentially. So it won't be long, and the whole colony will be full of Varroa. So yeah, so it's just swapping from the no Varroa to one Varroa to numerous Varroa, and it's a very, very quick transition. So as soon as you see it, then you need to have a plan before you see it, so that you know how you're going to manage this.
Yeah, what you're going to start with. Yeah.
And if it doesn't work, that's okay. Revisit it. Go back and do it again. Go back and look at your management. Okay, we lost some hives. We tried some organic products, they didn't work. We tried these particular products, they didn't work. We tried a biotechnical method, it didn't work. So weed them out and then move on to the next one. So that's what's really important, to make sure that you've got a really good sound management program for your Varroa. Without that, you won't have, number one, hives, and then obviously number two, your honey production. So the threshold that's kind of thrown around by a lot of countries is based on an actual economic threshold. So that number of mites per number of bees is based on a longitudinal study that was done, and over that threshold, the population of mites was such that it caused the honeybees to collect less honey. And as beekeepers, we all want to be making money from our honey. We don't want our honey production to be reduced in any way. So the Varroa is going to reduce your honey production. So that's why you need to control your Varroa.
Yeah, I mean, and ultimately, you know, that treatment method that you choose, whatever that might be, and especially we're looking at trying to push, and we have another series that will talk in more detail about integrated pest management in Australia, because of our ongoing brood cycles and our lovely warm climate, perfect for Varroa. So I just wanted to touch on those efficacy topic around treating, around investing your time in something that you know or you believe will get you through. So you found Varroa. It's quite a high level. It's the time of year that you've reached this number and you go, yep, okay, I need to do something. People are kind of pushed to cut corners, or they have this, like, as you say, this investment in not wanting to implement chemicals. And I understand, and everybody understands that. That's for beekeeping, you know, it's an amazing thing to be doing. And in Australia so far, we've been so lucky to have the most natural beekeeping opportunities ever. But that's going to change, and we do need to take little steps towards really understanding that. Do you think that efficacy really just it's going to be an unknown for us? We just think we can use anything, and there's lots of ideas out there that certain chemicals will work, certain organic chemicals will be better. You talked about in the past soft and hard chemicals, and you wished that we didn't, or that New Zealand didn't talk about the chemical treatments in that way. And I just wanted to, we've got all these people, and I see it all over the place, of trying different things and thinking that we'll get a different result in Australia. What do you know about that kind of efficacy risk that we won't know? So we are we're a land of explorers. We try things, we want to sort things out, we want to find a new way, and I imagine you guys are very similar with that mentality. So what that means is you have a potential to lose a lot of colonies if you don't manage them in a way that is, it will actually kill Varroa. So what I'll tell you what is good, and then I'll tell you what I've seen. So what is good is if you can use in those very first years, give yourselves a break. Use a treatment strip that you can use that you know will control the Varroa, and then try some alternative things on a small number of colonies, ones that you're prepared to lose. In an apiary, choose a small section of it, choose 10 hives in that apiary, and manage that in the way that you think you'd like to give that a go. And then if they survive, then extend that on to a few more in the apiary next year, or next treatment that you need. But if they die,
then be okay with the fact that they died. It was a learning experience, and move on to the next treatment that you would like to try. So that's what I would recommend.
Yeah, I mean, a cost benefit is part of that decision. Yeah,
absolutely. Go with tried and true, because you can't afford to lose them all, because the next few years are going to be expensive for you. Make sure that you're going to control your Varroa, but then try those other ones if you feel the need, as we all did, to see if they would work. So we have some examples. So I've got some, little scars on, well, shouldn't say it's on my hand, but anyways, from formic acid and oxalic acid, both, because it splashes. So those chemicals that are organic chemicals, generic I'm talking about, I'm not talking about company products. So generic products that, you get in a liquid form, they are dangerous to us. And the ratio that they have between the killing of the mite and the killing of the bee is much tighter. So I only need 4 times the concentration of an organic product to kill my bees, compared to a synthetic product that I might need 100 to 200 times the product to kill my bees. So that's what you need to keep in mind when you're testing these bees, how much of an impact it could have on your bees, not just your Varroa. So yeah, so that's kind of thing. I have seen beekeepers use organic products and lose, 600, 1,000 colonies, just because they thought they'd try this one. It's the next new thing coming through, and it didn't work. So, and I saw that both when I was in America and in New Zealand. And so that was devastating to me, because you try a small number, see if it works, and if it does, then great, and if it doesn't, so be it. But just edge it up slowly. The other one is at the other end. So we're at the other end of it now. So we've gone through that very unusual stage of the first few years where there's really not always a good pattern. So we're into a good pattern now, but our education program was a long time ago, so we've forgotten some of the basics. And so for us as an industry, it's going back to the basics, reminding ourselves what those basics are. Good bee health, good replacement of frames, good, hive wear, all that sort of thing, that they're getting the proper nutrients that they need, not sugar syrup, but actually still having the pollen that's in that nectar that they're collecting. They're getting those nutrients and that they need. So those sorts of things, the basics are really important for beekeeping. So as you're going to the stage, if you haven't got Varroa in your area now, make sure your beekeeping is up top notch, absolutely perfect. And then you can deal with the Varroa coming in underneath that, because you'll know that your colonies are good, and then the rest of it will fall into place.
Yeah, that's awesome sound experienced advice. Love to hear that. So yeah, can you talk a little bit then about that bee health risk, and what do people have to make a tough decision of to kill off weak or heavily infested colonies? Is that something that happens still? Did it happen at the start? Is it still going on? Is it where you've got livestock, you've got dead stock? That's a saying that I have in my family, and I think that it's really paramount to understand whether continuing with something is worthwhile. And I think in terms of honeybee industry, we're going to have a lot of those hard decisions to make. And do you think we should be really aware that's, like you talked about people leaving the industry, but in terms of just that individual business, do they have to make those decisions at this stage, or are they making more of those like, oh, this colony is really weak, I could probably recover it with some synthetic chemicals that we're allowed to use, and that might help them, but will there be a turning point in that ability?
Good question. And because you've got your season allows for brood production all year round, the risk of you is much higher than it is in New Zealand. But what we've seen in New Zealand is that if you have a colony that has really succumbed to Varroa and you help it to limp along through winter, then it won't really collect a honey crop, and you'll have just been putting money into it with your sugar syrup. So pretty much beekeepers now, the mentality is, and part of our education program was, you might have 1,200 hives now, and because you can manage 1,200 hives by yourself, or well, back in our day, back in when our Varroa first came in, you could manage 750 hives per beekeeper. That's just the way New Zealand beekeeping was. When Varroa came in, that number dropped down to 350, 400 hives per beekeper.
Right. So that's like time management, or lost that number and kept the remainder, or a bit of both?
Yeah. So some of those were lost, obviously, but what that meant is that they either had to hire more people to help put in the treatment strips, to help manage them, to help keep that nutrition up, all those sorts of things, or they had to just reduce the number. And so what we recommended, or what was part of our education program, was that every hive has to make more dollars. So you don't just take it for one place and get honey anymore. You go and you get some pollination money for that hive. For that hive, you also get some honey or 2 honey crops. From that hive, you can take some pollen off. From that hive, you could take some propolis off. So you make that one hive work, because every hive that you have costs a certain amount of money to treat. So if you can increase the income whilst maintaining the expense, then you're gonna replace those colonies that you had lost. So travel was the other thing. That was one of the major costs for some of our beekeepers was travel. So cutting down the costs and making sure that they
beekeepers.
Absolutely.
Travel is just absolute, without doubt, a factor for us.
Yeah. So we don't tend to go and stay in the places that we drop our hives off, where we didn't used to. So, you go and drop them off and that sort of stuff. But now with Varroa control, that's not quite the case. You have to go and put the treatment strips in, and then come back and take the treatment strips out, or you have to manage the colonies differently to what you used to have to. So that takes time. And so the closer they are to home, to your hub, the easier it is to get out there and put them in, and to get out there and take them off. So that's kind of probably one of the bigger differences between our industry and yours, is the distance, and like I say, we wouldn't stay near our colonies. We would tend to drop them off and then leave, and then go back for management stuff or whatever. Whereas now we limit the amount of travel that we have to do. So we'll take more people when we go, that sort of stuff.
Yeah,
sure
sort of
everything done quickly.
That expense, whether it's time or money, really. Yes, they all add up to that factoring in to that ability to manage. And that sort of speaks to volumes of your comment before about having a plan for when you do get it, because just that matter of time, and the more you can plan now, I guess, in terms of people overseeing even if they are a recreational beekeeper, no matter where they are or how they beekeep, they do need to sort of start to consider the environment their bees are in, the likelihood of the extra workload, travel, labour costs for them, their employees, or just themselves. Yeah, so it's that's a really good point, just being able to have a bit of a holistic business view of how they're going to manage it, and keeping low Varroa numbers in colonies once we all have Varroa is key to them surviving. It's not impossible, because everybody's been doing that around the world, and we're lucky to be able to have this sort of coordination of information from all the different parts to make it work best for us and try really hard. In terms of, you mentioned about seeking pollination to, either introduce it as a new thing for some beekeepers, but also to provide additional income. We've had conversations in Australia about coordinating treatments around pollination events. Does that happen in NZ?
So in New Zealand, in those first few years when it was really unpredictable, our colonies would go into kiwifruit pollination, and they only if they had treatment strips in them, and so that helped mitigate a lot of the
waves of infection,
the waves that were. So now, that for us is a spring activity, so we don't see those sorts of issues anymore because it's all settled down. But at the time, it was a bigger thing, and that was part of the we talked about slowing the spread. We had some movement controls in place, so we could move hives up from the South Island, or could move the hives up from the lower part of the North Island over our line that we had, that was determined, but you couldn't move them back. So we found is that a lot of the hives, beekeepers were, super entrepreneurial, so they would supply hives into these areas, and then they would sell them into the areas, and then they wouldn't get them back. But that was fine. It was part of what they did. Other beekeepers, they set up their businesses in 2 areas, so they had
like a north operation and south operation.
Okay. Exactly. So they had a lower and an upper operation going on that never met, and so that's how they manage their Varroa. And so we talked earlier about that importance of giving yourself time. So those beekeepers there, they would manage their lower operations without Varroa, and the upper ones with, and it just meant that they had the expense of the Varroa didn't pass on to that until it needed
the
to.
Entire business model.
Exactly.
Yeah, we could have similar impacts here with our New South Wales zones and beekeepers who operate in both. And
Exactly.
look, I don't think that regulation is the only opportunity to slow the spread. So it's really great to just have those other components about that practice change to limit the spread, and people can do it. You clearly just articulated that people did it in NZ within their own business. So choosing to go to an area where you might see that, or that Varroa exists, is that balance that beekeepers only know whether that's valuable to them or not. Yeah, I can see that as our regulations are removed, that the best chance for us is that our education starts to increase as a country. And when Varroa starts to spread, that we've got this level already. We've reached a level of competency, I suppose you could say, that we've got a little bit of confidence about, and a plan for some people that we're just going to have to start figuring out.
Exactly.
Yeah, as a country. So I guess this kind of might be sort of close to the end. And I wanted to just ask you kind of a final question, and I'm going to be asking all of our series participants about this, just one question. So what's your advice for Australian beekeepers who we're all learning, we're all adapting through this new challenging phase? How can we stay on course? What's your best advice for us?
Be kind to each other. Just have some grace. You're gonna stuff up, and just be okay with that. Don't expect yourself to get it right the first time, but just pick yourself back up and do it again. Start again. Retry. That's probably don't be too hard on yourself. Yeah, exactly. Our industry is amazing. We do so much for our countries, and we need to make sure that our bees are alive and we look after them well, and because they look after us well. So if you can manage those bees beautifully and look after and control that Varroa for them, then you'll be in a better place as a country.
Excellent. That's great. Thank you. Thanks so much. Look, on behalf of AgriFutures and AHBIC and our beekeeping community in Australia, thank you for participating. You're very valuable to this series, and we really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. Bye.